Welcome to Wine for Normal People, the podcast for people who like wine, but not the snobbery that goes with it. I'm your host, Elizabeth Schneider, author of the Wine for Normal People book and certified wine dork. This show is sponsored by Wine Access, the go-to source of people in the wine industry for hard-to-find, limited production, high-quality wines at great prices. You can hop online anytime at wineaccess.com/WFMP to get into the site, or better yet, let me make it easier for you by selecting your wines. Join my wine club. Let me and Wine Access pick out 6 amazing bottles for you quarterly for just $150, which includes shipping. Wineaccess.com/normal. Listen in the middle of the show for more details. Here is another back to basics show. This one's a little bit more confusing than the first time I did it. It was episode 7 in 2011. So it was a long time ago. And since that time, some stuff has changed about people's feelings on using New World and Old World. So I'll get into all of that. And I'm going to spend a lot of time just talking about why I still think that these are valid terms, despite what other people like in the industry think. I don't really know that it matters to us as normal wine people. I think this is a real insider baseball debate, but I also wonder if in the outside world, when people are talking about Old World and New World, that it's also a debate in historical circles. It seems to be a little bit less so, but I don't really know. Okay, before we get started, I need to thank the patrons, patreon.com/wine for normal people. Please join Patreon if you have the means and the desire. It helps keep the podcast going, and you get a ton of great perks. I just had a meet up in Raleigh with the Raleigh folks here in North Carolina. I'm doing another one in DC. So if you would like to meet me, you might have that opportunity. People are going out to dinners together. They're going to wineries together. There's just so much going on. Plus, there's tons of proprietary content. So pretty much anything you want to dork out on is on Patreon. I've written about so much stuff. I think there's like 1,800 posts. It's the only place that you can get the whole back catalog of the podcast for $3 a month. And you get a 10% discount if you join for the year. It is patreon.com/wine for normal people. And I want to thank the new patrons and welcome them into the community. You get a shout out if you join for the year. Clint W., Ronan, Linda S., Stephanie C., Corby D., Ryan P., Tracy W., Adam, Rodrigo, Kelly M., and Katrina. Welcome to the Wine for Normal People fam. Get on the site as soon as you can. Go into the chats, start asking questions. There's a lot of people who will answer your questions and they'll make you laugh. And the thing I always hear is like, oh, I'd really like to meet that person. They seem so funny on Patreon, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of virtual friendships on Patreon. It's just a really like-minded community of people who are super cool about wine. It's a great thing if it's your hobby to just enjoy the community, and it does support my work and let me keep going. Without further ado, let's do this refresh on Old World and New World terms and talk about some of the objections to it and then some of the things that we could consider to keep the terms. I don't know. I'm going to lay it all out for you now. So let's start with the definitions. I think that would be helpful because I feel like either you use these terms a lot or you use them sometimes, or you know what they are, or you have no idea what I'm talking about. So no matter what, this should help. Old World is Europe. So when somebody says it's an Old World wine, an Old World, really anything, they're talking about Europe. And when we're talking about it's really concentrated on Western Europe. I mean, that's where most of the wine in the world is made. So that makes a lot of sense. We're talking about the countries of France and Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany. I mean, it could include Belgium, it could include Switzerland, it could include a lot of other things. In my opinion, it includes the UK. I know some people think of the UK as more New World, but they did make wine a long time ago. Then they stopped. Now they make it again because of climate change. And it's also sort of Europe adjacent, even though it's not necessarily considered Europe. Greece is squarely in the Old World, Slovenia, Croatia, the Eastern European countries. I would say all of that is Old World. And then you might be like, wait, what about those places that have been making wine for a really long time? Yeah, technically, Armenia and Georgia are in Eastern Europe, so that would count as part of the Old World. But I kind of think there's this other thing, which would be the really, really old world, the ancient wine world. And that would be Armenia and Georgia, which fight it out for who had the first winemaking tradition. I'm pretty sure Armenia's got a little edge on that because they found a full-fledged winery from 8,000 years ago. But Georgia's been doing it for a really long time. China, totally possible that they've been making wine for 10,000 years. We don't have a lot of information. China's a little protective of that information. And then the Middle East, although they don't make wine anymore because it converted mostly to Islam and alcohol is illegal in that religion, we do have Israel and Lebanon, which make wine actively now and can make really good wine. And then there are a bunch of other countries that used to make wine, especially Iraq, which is the cradle of civilizations. The ancient world or the super old wine world, whatever we want to call it, is a tradition anywhere from about 5,000 years, which is what we see in Israel and Lebanon, to about 8,000 or 10,000 years. So that would be the super old wine world. Some of it is a subset of the old world. New world is a lot more clear cut for sure because we don't have anything ancient. It's really defined by countries that were colonized. The current culture is either wholly or partly derived from whatever country conquered the area. So it could be Portugal or it could be Spain, it could be England, whatever. Those countries that were colonized have a derivative component of European culture. Part of that is wine. So to put a finer point on it, it's North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. That's the geographical definition of the New World. And the terms come from old versus new. It's, first of all, it's a geographical distinction, which I just talked about, and it's also a historical distinction. If we just take Christopher Columbus, he discovered, we'll put that in quotation marks, new lands in 1492, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And he found a bunch of places that were new to him. He and the other explorers looked at this as worlds that were unfamiliar to them, so they were new. That was in comparison to the world that they knew, the familiar world, the existing world in their lives, which was the old world. As people were talking about where these places were, it was a way to distinguish between Europe and then the lands that were colonized by Europeans about 530 years ago. A really long time, yet the idea of old and new are almost more like capturing a point in time, and then we just kept using that. I mean, it has been 500 years, but we're still using it. The historical distinction is also super important because from a wine perspective, Old World is the place where wine was born in its current incarnation. It was developed, and it's the place from which it spread. It's the origin of wine. It's the bedrock of wine. And without Romans spreading viticulture all over Europe 2,000 years ago, we would not have wine as we know it today anywhere, definitely not in Europe. And so after people were established in the wine tradition of the Old World for 1,500 years, when they went to the New World, for many reasons, a lot of it was for religious and sacramental purposes. So they had to plant vines right away because you had to make sure that you had wine for mass. That was an important thing, especially how grapes wound up in Peru in 1531. It was missionaries that were doing that. But once they got these grapes to the New World and had them survive, they were trying to make wines that they could recall, that they could remember, techniques that they used in the past. So it is derivative. And in many places, pretty much except North America, there are no native grapes. The New World countries were bringing grapes from Europe. The new also connotes immigrants that came in and brought a melting pot of ideas to Australia, to New Zealand, to South America, to North America. And they created new traditions and they created new ways of doing things. They had to adapt. In the Hunter Valley in Australia, for instance, they tried to grow the same grapes in the same way that they grew them in Europe, and they realized they could not do that. So they had to change the techniques, and they had brought in German immigrants who were wine farmers, but it didn't work out. They had to adapt as well. So the New World had to be adapted to the climate realities there, but it was derivative of the Old World. Style is the main thing that people get hung up on in terms of wine. It's not really the geography, although people don't like the old and new world terms. I think it's the style thing that makes people really, really mad in the wine world. In wine, old world and new world are this shorthand for style. And this is where the fallout starts in the wine industry. And there's some particular writers, too, especially, that have just gone off on this idea. And then there's some people who don't agree. And I did not do this earlier. I need to thank Tom Wark. He spent a lot of time on the phone with me. I probably should have even had him on this show talking about these issues and really sorting through what we should be calling these regions, whether we agree with these writers or not, and then parsing out the reasons for me, especially why I don't. People say old world wines have flavors and aromas that aren't fruit first. There's fruit there, but it's not first. So you might get herbs or earth. You might get minerals. You might get leather notes. Usually speaking, kind of cooler climates. I'm going to talk about all the science behind this in a second. More acidity and less sun means less sugar, less alcohol. These wines are less upfront on the fruit and are sometimes more difficult to like right away. They're not sippers usually, and they do have a lot of complexity with aging. And that's the reputation of an old world wine. When you think of an old world wine, you're thinking of something that is, as Tom says in his blog post, which I'll link to, the image is that they are unmanipulated, they're non-interventionist, these wines are elegant, and they're terroir driven, and they're pure, and they're definitely noble, and they're all about the vineyard, and they're all about the vintage, and they basically don't even need the winery. It just is like making itself by magic. That's the old world. And then the new world, the stereotype is that wines are ripe and fruity, and they're sometimes oaky and buttery and toasty from all the winemaking and all the oak and the malolactic fermentation. And these are higher alcohol wines because there's a lot of sunshine, which leads to more sugar. And with time, they are not as complex. So if you hold them for a long time, they're not going to get the complexity that you would get from a European wine. Tom Wark says that these are the Parkerized wines. So Robert M. Parker Jr. was a lawyer who started the Wine Advocate, which was a newsletter, and it was highly influential and changed the entire wine world. His palate was all about these big, juicy, highly oaked wines. And a lot of people changed their styles all over the world to try to get Parker points. So there were the Parker point chasers, and then there were the people that didn't care. And usually the people that didn't care were old world, and the people that did care were trying to emulate the new world with technology. It was all about your personality and all about consistency year after year. They didn't really care about vintage variation. What this wound up doing is it set up a position where if you didn't like Parker, you didn't like New World wines. Wine snobs used New World to connote less sophisticated wines, wines that were not as complex, simple wines, wines that had high alcohol. And in doing that, they were nasty to the New World wine producers, and there was a sense of hierarchy. Not good, and I'll talk about that later. I do want to say, speaking of Robert Parker, I came across something very funny in my research that I wanted to share. I don't even know when this is. I didn't bother, honestly, to look it up, but it was a long time ago that Robert Parker tweeted, or now X, did a tweet on Twitter, and it said, lots of top wine merchants are heavily discounting once very expensive Aussie Shirazes, out of fashion among the anti-flavor wine elites. So this made people really mad. He made a bunch of people mad. First of all, he made people who loved Australian Shiraz mad because they were like, excuse me, it's not out of fashion. What are you talking about? So that made them angry. And then it made people who liked more restrained wines and not his style of wines go after him and be like, what are you talking about? Also, you just called us anti-flavor wine elites. So there are some circles in which people refer to more restrained wines as AFWE, anti-flavor wine elite wines. It's a little funny. I'm not going to lie. It's like claiming the insult, but I had never seen that before. I will not be using it, but it is something to get a little chuckle over people's creativity, taking something negative and turning it into a positive, I guess. So, but back to this old world, new world thing. Here's the argument. And I'm about to make a lot of counterpoints to this, which you can take or not take. This is really just a thought exercise for us. I'm not foisting my ideas upon you. I just want to share my opinion on it, and I'm going to share other people's opinions on it. The argument is that as a shorthand for style, these big fruity wines that are kissed with sunshine versus these restrained wines that grow in different places and have different styles, that this is total and utter BS. Because a lot of the wines, they argue, in the New World are complex. They have lower alcohol and higher acidity than Old World wines. And to quote one of these people, and I'm not going to call them out by name because I don't want to start a wine war, but these writers, they write for some big publications and some of them are influential in the wine world. One woman said, "The wine world will be much better off when it sheds the antiquated Old World, New World stereotypes that confuse instead of clarify." So what she's saying is using Old World, New World stereotypes confuses people. And then another person said, "Old World and New World no longer retain any stylistic meaning." And the person goes on to say we should use modern or classic to describe a style. Traditional or classic would be how people used to do things before technology, the old school prototype. And even Tom, who I think I might have changed his tune, I was very convincing, I swear. But he, in his post, also said the bottom line is that it's no longer possible to tie any given stylistic expression to a location, a place, which the old world, new world narrative presupposes. Okay, now you've got the historical background, you've got the geographical background, and then you have the arguments against New World and Old World. I do want to add, even though I didn't quote it, there is definitely a political bent towards a lot of this. This is part of things where people say wine is exclusive, and because we're calling it Old World and New World, we are antiquated. We won't accept any changes. It's been 500 years. Nothing's new anymore. This is a stupid term, which I've already laid out. I want to break this down piece by piece. Let's talk about the history and the geography. I am going to argue that there's historical and geographical grounding. It's 500 years old. I get it. But Europe had a 1,500-year-old tradition and even older before it brought wine to a lot of these newer areas. Although it's not new to people in this day and age, it's still more recent than the wine tradition of the old world. I would argue that it's a good way to connote places, the difference between places, and connote the old world is the original. Wine comes from there. The vinifera grapes come from there. The methods come from there. The etiquette and the rituals come from there. Even the barrels largely come from there. My objection is old is not the most flattering term. But if we go back to the age of discovery, that's what stuck. This was the world that they knew. That was the old world. And now there's new stuff. And yes, I understand the political argument that colonialism and imperialism was really terrible. I am never going to say anything besides that. But I am going to say that for wine, it gave this beverage an opportunity to touch a lot of places because of the European colonialism. This idea of European winemaking around the globe came because of imperialism. So we would not have New World wine without colonialism. And this was a positive thing for wine. You can dislike the terms, but it is kind of useful to be able to think we have the old stuff that has been around a really long time. We know geographically, New World were all colonies. And because they were colonies, wine became something that they made at first, usually for religious purposes or logistical reasons. But then it became a big part of the tradition as more immigration took place, more people became interested in making wine over the course of centuries. So the idea that it doesn't have any historical or geographical utility, I don't agree with that. The second and third points are probably the more convincing ones. And the second one is science. I'm not going to talk about sociological or historical issues here. I'm talking about latitude. So latitude is not the whole story. I want to be really clear about that. There's a lot of different elements. Talking in broad strokes, we know that with latitude, the further a location is from the equator, the less sunlight it gets. Usually that means that there's lower heat. It usually means there's cooler temperatures. At the equator, you have a really direct hit of sunlight, and that's going to have a lot of heat right at that direct hit. As you move away from the equator, there's less intense heat from the sun. So you're going to have a different level of sunlight just based on latitude. Also, the Earth is tilted on its axis. As you move north from the equator, the sun's light is going to start hitting at an angle. We're not having a direct hit anymore. It's starting to hit at an angle, and the effect becomes more extreme the farther north you go. If a vineyard is at 35 degrees north latitude and another vineyard is at 45 degrees north latitude, even if they're in the same climatic zone, the sunlight difference will make a difference in those wines. So if we look at some of the regions in Australia and California and South Africa and parts of Chile and Argentina, we can see that just from a pure latitude and sunlight receiving perspective, it's going to be different. The latitudes are much lower in the New World in general. Okay, we're going to take a step away from the podcast to thank Wine Access, the best online site to discover interesting small production wines you can't get anywhere else. If you are a busy person and you don't have time to shop when the stores are open, I kind of relate to you. You can hop on anytime to wineaccess.com/WFMP. That will take you into the site. It will let them know that you found out about them through me, and you will see standing collection and then wines that are changing all the time. The team is tasting thousands of wines a year. They only select the best for the site. And there is everything on there, from small Napa and Sonoma wineries to elite Burgundies. There's great Tasmanian wines. There's wines from South Africa, South America. So why not go there and check it out? Or better yet, you could let me make it easy for you and I will select your wines for you. Join my wine club. Let me and the Wine Access team pick out 6 amazing bottles for you quarterly, just $150. That includes shipping. Wineaccess.com/normal to join the wine club. And remember that if you join the wine club, you get discounts on all purchases you make. Wineaccess.com/WFMP. I will give another plug for Patreon. If you haven't joined to support this show and keep it going and become part of this amazing international community with people from all parts of the globe, do it today. Patreon.com/winefornormalpeople, patreon.com/winefornormalpeople. I can't tell you how much it means to me when I see a new patron join. This is how I am able to continue to do this work. And if you join Patreon, you will see there is a ton of exclusive content from me. It's the only way to access the back catalog of the podcast, all of the episodes that are older than a year. Also, don't forget classes, winefornormalpeople.com/classes. Wines of France is coming up this week. The Greats of Bordeaux Part 1 is the week after, and I will start posting other classes for March and April very soon. I am taking the patrons on a trip to Veneto and Alto Adige in May, so that's going to interrupt our class schedule. Besides that, there will be new, fun, amazing classes, lots of great stuff. winefornormalpeople.com/classes. Now let's get back to the show. That said, there's some mitigating factors. The climate of a place is also affected by lots of other things. We could take the air currents, the jet stream that everybody loves to talk about. A jet stream is a strong, fast-moving wind that occurs in the atmosphere. It's above us. The jet stream or the Gulf Stream is going to churn over the ocean's warm surface at the Gulf of Mexico. And that heat is going to be released and it's going to blow to Europe. Or the Gulf Stream releases heat into the atmosphere and that's what winds up in Europe. Either way, Europe's got more moderate temperatures. They don't have the harsh winters that other places at the same latitude have. That's a good example of mitigating factors. Latitude is often used to compare regions. People might say, we grow Pinot Noir at the same latitude as Burgundy. But if you're growing Pinot Noir on the Sonoma coast or in Oregon, you don't have the same situation as Burgundy because those places have some wind coming in from the Pacific. In Oregon, for instance, you have some Pacific influence, you have some continental influence, there's a river there. What does Burgundy have? Burgundy is not near an ocean. It has mild influence from the Atlantic, although it's very far away. The river there does not affect the vineyards, and a lot of it just has to do with the semi-continental climate of the region and the soil types and things like that. So to say that you're at the same latitude as Burgundy really doesn't compare well. That's not a great thing to do. But it does mean that you're getting similar sunlight. That's pretty much all you can say. Climate is another thing. It's not apples to apples. So I read this brilliant article by Gregory Jones. He's the head of Abicello Winery in Southern Oregon, but he's also an American research climatologist. He specializes in climatology around viticulture. He talks in this article, which I will post, about geology, landscape, and soil. Those things are going to change the interaction between climate and the vine, especially drainage and the amount of nutrition in the soil for the vines. Everything is very local. But if we compare New World and Old World, now we see really big geological differences between these regions. And when you want to compare them, you really can't. We're going from a completely different scenario when you go from Bordeaux to Napa Valley. Yeah, some of the soil types are similar, but nothing else is really the same. One of the things that Jones brings up in this article, which I think is so smart, is that people love to say, we have a Mediterranean climate. Oftentimes that's misinterpreted because if you are actually in the Mediterranean, you have the influence of two large bodies of water. You have the Atlantic on one side and you have the Mediterranean on the other. And regions that also have the same heat index and some of the same climate patterns don't have these factors. A lot of them are more near like one coastline. Some of them are inland. And usually there's only one body of water, and true Mediterranean climates have two bodies of water. There's a lot of climate differences. There's a lot of different structures. So to say that something is Mediterranean, so therefore they can grow the same thing and make the same styles as Chianti or parts of Greece, the argument doesn't really hold. Latitude, you're getting the same amount of sunlight, but you have to look at all of the factors, and none of the factors is going to be exactly the same. If we take soil alone, all right, let's just look at soil for a second. Again, I just told you I'm going to really concentrate on the terroir differences here. In the old world, given the geological machinations, given the fact that there were a lot of small seas that receded in various parts, you could look at Chablis and Burgundy and Champagne. You can look at most of Tuscany was underneath a sea. So you have marine deposits in a lot of those places, but those marine deposits a lot of times are limestone. So up in the north, in Champagne and in northern Burgundy, you're going to have limestone and chalk. That's a soil type that you do find in the New World, but much less so than in a lot of parts of Europe. Clay limestone, which is marl. Marl is another one. You have to have limestone in order to have marl, and there's less of that in parts of the New World. Slate. Slate is a very specific type of soil, as is schist. These are metamorphic type soils. You might find pockets of these things in the New World, but in the Old World, there's large concentrations of things like slate and schist. Granite is another thing. Not a whole lot of active volcanoes in the recent past geologically in the Old World. So all of that just stayed under the ground and is in the form of igneous rock, in form of granite. You also have silex. That's something that you'll see in Sancerre. Sandstone, which is in a ton of places. That's also in a ton of places in the New World. The particle size, if we're talking about clay versus sand, there's a lot more clay in the Old World than there is in the New World. In the New World, you see more volcanic and basalt soils. They're softer than granite. The roots have really great opportunity to permeate those soils and dig down deep. You have alluvial and loam soils, a little bit more fertile. We see those alluvial fans in the Napa Valley. And there's some pockets of all types of soils that I mentioned in Europe, but maybe not the kind of concentration of these soils that we see in Europe. So just from a scientific perspective, we could say that the latitudes are different. So there is a different angle of the sun. And added to that, there are different soil types, there are different formations. And so you need to look at individual factors. A lot of the places in Europe have very different conditions than places that are on paper the same in the New World. So we just need to keep that in mind, that from a scientific perspective, we really can't argue with the fact that different things are going on in these two worlds, shall we say, and that in many of the really famous winemaking regions of Europe, these places have fairly uniform soils or fairly uniform mixes of soils. The other factor is probably one of the most important, if not the most important, which is the laws and the traditions, which make old world wines set in their place. they have a rules-based appellation system. They have the PDO system, the protected designation of origin, the PGIs, protected geographical indication. This system allows protection of regions with a tradition of winemaking, and they really regulate it within an inch of its life. You have the stages of vineyard management, yields and farming techniques, use of pesticides, how you can prune or trellis. They go through production and how that's carried out in a really specific way. A lot of it is based on historical production methods. Of course, the vineyard is based on geological features, and that's how they make the lines for these appellations as well. And it gives the wines a very distinctive flavor, a very distinctive quality, and they have to be approved by a board. When you make wine, it has to be a blend of recognizable grapes. It has to oftentimes have certain aging requirements. There's almost always a minimum bottling date, how long you have to let the wine sit and marry before you bottle it. There's oftentimes a maximum alcohol by volume and a minimum alcohol by volume. This is very regulated to set a specific style within old world wines. There's uniformity to a certain extent. As a result, the wines usually are of a certain quality, and that generally means that they're less fruity. If we couple that with the angle of the sun, a lot of the weather components, a lot of the places that have these different soil types, you're going to get wines that really do fit the stereotype. One of the arguments against the AOC, DOC, GDO system, whatever you want to call it, is that producers are so restricted. How could they do anything creative? It's like a recipe. If you talk to European producers, sometimes they're frustrated by the regulations, but a lot of times they're really proud to work within the system. And there are so many challenges in the vineyard, and there's so many challenges with each vintage. They don't feel like they're losing out by following appellation rules. They feel like they're carrying on a tradition that their grandparents carried on, or the great-grandparents, or many generations before them. And the other thing that we need to realize is that the appellations themselves made the rules. It's not like the French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, German government went in and said, these are the ways that you have to make the wine. These were collections of people who decided together, based on the traditions, how do we get something that's closest to the profile that we want to represent? It's just a very different philosophy. The other thing I'll say about old world wines, sometimes they are made specifically to be out of balance. And I know that sounds really bad, but if you're laying down a wine for aging for a really long time, you don't care if the tannins are rough to begin with, as long as the other components come together. That wine shouldn't be consumed right away. If they're built to age, they're going to be a different criteria. What if they're built to go with the local food? If the local food needs something that's really high in acidity, that may be not something you want to sip, but it could be the best pairing with food. So sometimes, because the orientation is not to make a wine that's necessarily totally complete on its own, but as part of a meal, you're going to get different wine styles, and not all of them are going to be great for sipping. And that is part of the old world tradition, because they are looking at food and wine pairings very seriously. In my estimation, the old world is appropriately named, and it does indicate a style or a collection of styles or a regulated collection of styles for that alone. I do not think that we should drop the term old world. I think it is a cohesive set of regions and places. Of course, there are exceptions. Of course, there are places that make wines that are very bold and fruity and all the rest. But in general, if we took a random sample of grapes from around all of Europe, I think you would find that they've conformed to this stereotype, mostly. Now we have the New World. The New World, it's spread out. It is really unfair to compare an area as concentrated as Europe with the New World. The New World, these are, as I mentioned before, lands of immigrants, originally immigrants with diverse backgrounds. They had a spirit of adventure. They had a spirit of creativity. They did not want to live by the same rules and restrictions as the parent countries. Many of them were fleeing oppression. The styles, although they are original, they're also derivative, because they needed to take the plant matter from Europe and figure out how it could adapt to some of these new places, as I talked about with the Hunter Valley before. The only uniformity these days, though, in New World wine is that we do varietal labeling so that we know what grape it is. And yes, there's a place on it. Problem is, there aren't any real regulations on the place except that the wine has to be from within the boundaries in most places in the New World. In the US, an American viticultural area can't always tell you what style the wine's going to be. You don't know. So it could be whatever the producer has in mind. And there's a ton of different styles. You could do different things with the same grapes. You could do different combinations. And there's nothing to regulate that. And with a often better and predictable climate and better weather, you do often have these wines that are extremely complete and awesome sippers. But there are no rules. So that means that you're going to run the gamut. My conclusions here are this. I'll just say it again. Old World has a cohesive meaning when we're talking about wine style. There's a small percentage of Old World wines growing in warm to hot climates that might taste fruitier, maybe in warm parts of Spain, in warm parts of Portugal, in parts of Sicily, in Rhone. Châteauneuf-du-Pape can really remind us of New World wines. Or Languedoc. Those places often have fruit-forward styles that we might have in a blind tasting and think, yes, that is so New World. It has to be New World. But as I said, on balance, if you rounded up a lot of Old World wines, I think you would find that the stereotype is mostly true. The issue I have with terminology is not Old World. It's actually not even with New World if we're saying that it connotes a place and a general idea that given the history and a lot of the geographical, geological, and climate factors, New World wines do tend to be a lot more fruity. They tend to sometimes have more winemaking finesse because there's more technology. Again, more adventuresome people, fewer laws that dictate what you're allowed to do. The problem with the New World wines, a couple things. First of all, people use it in a pejorative way. And that is so insane to me. We're talking about wines from so many different countries and so many different places. It is so dumb. Wine is different and diverse. In my opinion, we should stop using comparisons. I know that the Judgment of Paris is the ultimate wine tasting, but we also have to think about what was going on in 1976 and in the early 70s. There were different climate conditions, and the style preferences in Napa and in California in general were things that were a little bit more restrained. Even if they tried today to replicate those wines, it's really hard to do because of climate change. And with different technology, different tastes, different consumer tastes, wines in the New World have catered to that bigger palate. And that's fantastic. There's so many people that love that palate, and not everything has to be a, what is it, AFWE wine. But the problem also is that there's such a range. You could do whatever you want. There's a huge range. Like you could pick early, you could pick late, you could put a certain oak on it. You could not do that. You could hang the grapes on the vine longer so that you get higher alcohol. You can pick them early so you don't. I kind of wish that New World wines, or at least like country by country, would adopt something like the International Riesling Foundation scale on the back of the bottle, where that runs from dry to sweet. It's like dry, off dry, medium sweet, sweet. And then you place your Riesling on that scale based on what it is. And in this case, it might be a little bit more subjective, but it would be nice to know if the style is a little bit more restrained or higher in acid, or it's very fruity. It would be nice if there was some standard by which we could judge New World wines, and then we could talk more about the styles that are there. New World can be very fruity. It doesn't have to be, but we do have to acknowledge that the geographical and geological features sometimes do make these wines quite fruity. And I think that some of the best winemakers in California, I know I'm being very California-centric, but I remember meeting Jim Clenendon from Au Bon Climat Wines in Santa Barbara. And I tasted his Chardonnay and I said, wow, this tastes a lot like a Burgundy. And he went ballistic on me and said, that is not a Burgundy. That will never be a Burgundy. This is a wine that has certain characteristics, and it is from Santa Barbara, and maybe it gives a nod to Burgundy, but it is not a Burgundy. And in a much nicer, gentler way, Greg LaFollette, who's been on the podcast a few times, said something similar. He's saying, look, we're not making European wines, we're making California wines. Greg LaFollette started Flowers and all of these really prestigious wineries on the Sonoma coast. He's a Pinot and Chardonnay god, and his wines do not fit the stereotype of being super fruity or super alcoholic or being over the top. But what he says is, look, we're not making European wines, we're making California wines, and maybe the style can be less alcoholic, maybe there can be less fruit, but it's derivative of its own place with its own flair. I think the problem for New World wines is that we don't have a lexicon that respects that. We don't have vocabulary that will respect that. We don't have a range that respects that. The term New World isn't an issue. It's good that it conjures up at least some ideas, but we need to stop thinking about it as something less than Old World. And we need to come up with better descriptions of the wines in the New World to understand what they are, because it is such a vast place. And I'm sorry, modern versus traditional, that doesn't mean anything to us as normal wine drinkers. We need to know, like, is it fruity? Is it oaky? Is it this? How helpful would that be? And on my last sort of like get off my lawn rant, I will say the following. It drives me nuts that people say over and over again when they're arguing about old and new world, you could blind taste something from the new world and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's not true for the majority of wines. It's true for, I don't even know what percentage. I'm just going to pull something out of my butt. Like, what is it? Maybe like 10, 20% maybe. But the majority of wines are sun-kissed and fruity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it seems like people want to constantly compare these two things when it's comparing apples to oranges. Europe's geology, Europe's climate, Europe's traditions, and Europe's laws, all of that is going to make very different wines from a place where there's a lot more sun, you're talking about lower latitudes, and you have an opportunity for each producer to represent themselves. As consumers, does it suck a tiny bit? Is it easier to buy European wines? I think it's much easier to buy them. We know what we're getting. At least, it can be bad, but we kind of know what we're getting. Once you know about European wines, it's maybe a little bit safer and easier to buy them. Look, we should be able to tell the difference between New World and Old World wines. I don't think there's an issue with them being different. Why do we have to keep putting them head to head in these blind tastings? To me, I understand why the Judgment of Paris was done. It was done to prove that California wines could be as good as French wines. But in this day and age, I think it's more important to appreciate wines on their own merits and understand that instead of wasting time comparing Bordeaux and Napa, which really are quite dissimilar, and trying to see what they are and whether or not they're the same, maybe we need to work more on how do we describe the differences between these wines instead of trying to see how similar they are. They're never going to be that similar. We just don't have the same terroir. And whether you guess it in a blind tasting or not, that's just the fact of the matter. That's my final point of get off my lawn rant. My bottom line here is the use of Old World and New World should not be criticized. I think people need to use the terms that they feel comfortable with. If you don't want to use them, you can find other terms, but they will be understood and they will be something that people will relate to. And that idea of the shorthand and style, for Old World, it makes sense. For New World, it may not. But it still does connote that the wines are from a different place. And I do think that we need to acknowledge that difference in wines is okay. And saying that a wine is from one of the derivative places versus the original wine places is absolutely fine. For us to say that there's something wrong with these terms is myopic. And I think it's unfair to us as wine drinkers for people to be dictating terms that are in the modern parlance, that are things we learned in school. For us to take that tool away as a descriptor, I don't think that's right. And I don't think that keeps us as normal wine drinkers in mind. I think that keeps a certain group of writers who wants to assert a new lexicon and change things, which fine, change is great. But in this particular case, I'm going to stick with New World and Old World, and I'm going to continue to visualize it in a way that's generally right. I've tasted lots of wine in my life, and I'm telling you, there is a difference. And that difference is beautiful and should be celebrated instead of us getting offended that New World wines are different from Old World wines. Okay, so that is my old lady shaking my cane at you. And with that, this has been another episode of Wine for Normal People. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.